Well, 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 if it isn't the consequences of my own actions. That should honestly be the tagline for Season 2 of The Bad Batch, because for The Bad Batch, Season 2 is all about consequences. For example, the consequences of clowning around and joining the Empire because your feelings were hurt, Crosshair. But we'll talk more about Crosshair and consequences in just a minute. In Season 1 of The Bad Batch, the main characters were presented with a choice in the face of the Imperial takeover: adapt and survive, or die with the past. For the Batch themselves, adapting and surviving meant deserting from the Republic-turned Imperial army and striking out on their own. For Crosshair, meanwhile, adapting and surviving meant proving himself a worthy soldier of the new Empire to avoid being phased out or otherwise eliminated, as we saw was already happening to the clone army. In the Season 1 finale, the entire Bad Batch chose to adapt, but how they chose to adapt could not have been more different. From the first 4 episodes, it seems like the main theme of The Bad Batch Season 2 is what happens after you make that choice. As Cody tells Crosshair in Season 2, Episode 3, you have to live with it. In this video, I'm going to be talking about this progression of Season 1's themes and what that progression means for the Bad Batch's character arcs. To do so, I'm going to break down 3 important conversations from the first 3 episodes, conversations I think reveal the most about the characters participating. I'm also going to be making a few shot-in-the-dark predictions about where the consequences of each character's choices might lead them this season, so not only will this video contain spoilers for the first 4 episodes of Season 2, but it may contain potential spoilers for the rest of the season. This video will be divided into 2 parts. In Part 1, we're going to be breaking down each character's Season 2 starting point. Obviously, we're only a quarter of the way through the season, so we can't talk about any character's full arc just yet because, well, we haven't seen them. What we can talk about is where we meet each character at the start of Season 2. Again, their starting point, as well as what challenges they are facing and how they might develop over the course of the story. In Part 2, I'm going to talk about how those 3 major conversations I mentioned earlier reveal a lot about the characters' starting points and maybe even hint at where their internal and, in some cases, external journeys may take them. Let's start with Hunter, who, like the rest of the Bad Batch, has fully embraced his new life as a space dad. At this point in Season 1, Hunter was still balking at the idea of raising Omega, but now he's stepped into this role quite comfortably. We see him giving her a stern talking to after their mission in the opening scene, and reviewing her study materials with her at Sid's bar. You know, typical dad stuff. Character goals are important, and Hunter's #1 priority is protecting Omega, which, let's be honest, he has never been very good at keeping her physically out of danger. Armed with a bow or not, Omega is a child, and he lets her tag along on dangerous missions all the time. Then again, Hunter is a clone, whether or not he is defective, or enhanced, or both, or whatever is going on with the Bad Batch. And clones are raised from childhood to think of themselves as soldiers. To Hunter, maybe the best way to keep Omega safe is to teach her to protect herself instead of fighting with her to keep her off missions. One thing that hasn't really changed since Season 1 is that Hunter is still plagued by the same passivity that was his main character flaw last season. He's comfortable where he is, running missions for Sid and raising Omega, and he's still reluctant to take any major risks or make any major changes to their lives, even though, as Sid points out, Imperial control threatens their operations on Ord Mantell and the future of his team. The main difference between Hunter in Season 1 and Hunter in Season 2 so far seems to be a difference in the way the rest of the team responds to him. In Season 1, Hunter's authority was absolute. He gave an order, and the rest of the batch followed it, usually without question. In the 2-episode Season 2 premiere, however, we see that the batch is more willing to question his decisions and even vote amongst themselves to overturn them. The squad discusses going after Count Dooku's war chest behind Hunter's back, and they agree that they want to attempt the mission even after Hunter has deemed it too risky. This scene was really interesting because it prompted me to think about Hunter as a leader and to wonder about how he became the Bad Batch's leader in the first place. Presumably, the Kaminoans or the higher-ups in the Republic's army put him in charge, but that military chain of command has now collapsed. The Bad Batch are deserters, which means that Hunter is no longer technically their sergeant. Now, I don't think this scene is indicating that there will be a power struggle or a mutiny or something within the Batch itself, but I do think it presents an interesting opportunity for Hunter to prove himself as a leader outside of a militarily enforced hierarchy. Hunter clearly has ideas about what it means to be a leader. In Season 1, he tells Crosshair that a real leader looks after his squad, and so far, Hunter is doing his best to remain true to that philosophy. You have to feel for Hunter in this situation. All he wants to do is keep his team safe, but circumstances, and occasionally his team themselves, prevent him from doing so. I'm actually surprised by how much I sympathize with Hunter this season. In Season 1, I found his wishy-washy leadership very frustrating, and I couldn't understand why he wouldn't do anything to help Crosshair back when Crosshair still had his inhibitor chip, or why he wouldn't do anything to help anyone unless Omega or Echo pressured him into it. But as we see the Empire growing stronger and stronger, we're forced to consider what we'd really be asking Hunter to do by fighting back against the Empire. He wants to protect his squad, his family, and I can't say I would be super willing to put my family on the line if I was in the same situation. I wish I could say that I would be like Echo, determined to do the right thing, but I think I would be too afraid of something happening to the people I care about, as Hunter is. Next, let's talk very briefly about Wrecker. Wrecker really didn't tip his hand much in these episodes when it comes to what he thinks the Batch's future should look like. But I don't think that means he doesn't have an opinion, and I'm curious to see whether or not we'll find out more about it in future episodes. He definitely surprised me by being 100% on board with the Sereno mission, in spite of Hunter's reservations, but then again, Wrecker has never been one to shy away from danger. He did seem somewhat abashed when he revealed to Hunter that the rest of the squad had taken a vote to go after the war chest without him. I also liked that Wrecker got to remind audiences of his mechanical skill in these opening episodes. He's right, he does make a good tank. Unlike Wrecker, Tech has been much more involved in the conversation about the Batch's future than I expected. First, we see Echo and Tech exchange this little nod before Echo confronts Hunter on the way to Sereno, almost as if Tech knows what he's going to do. And later, we overhear Echo and Tech not quite arguing about the squad situation and what Echo had hoped to do with the loot from Dooku's war chest. In this scene, Tech doesn't seem to sense the same urgency that Echo does, the imminence of the Empire and the impending choice the Batch will be forced to make about their future. Fast forward to Episode 4, when Tech makes two very interesting comments. He tells Sid that the mission she has sent Hunter and Echo on is not, quote, a proper use of the Batch's skill set. Later, he points out that
this is not the first time she has required our assistance due to her dealings with individuals of questionable integrity. It is a problematic pattern.
To me, these comments indicate that Tech is growing wary of the Batch's relationship with Sid and potentially unhappy with the arrangement they have settled into so completely. I also wanted to say that I like how Tech was the one to connect with Romar in the first two episodes. It felt consistent with his characterization in the Bad Batch arc of the Clone Wars, where he communicated with and generally got along better with the other clones much more readily than the rest of his squad. Tech seems like an open-minded, practical person, and I appreciate that about him. Also, and I know the cast has talked about this in a handful of interviews, but I love how we're already getting to see Tech being a dad to Omega this season. He supervises her studies, engages with her, and, hobbles through a forest on a fractured leg to find her when she's in danger. Honestly, if anyone deserved the #1 dad mug in those first two episodes, it was Tech. Now I want to talk about Echo. Then again, I always want to talk about Echo. In case it wasn't obvious, he's my favorite character in the Bad Batch. I've got that Clone Wars loyalty. I got the sense that Echo is growing restless as the Empire grows stronger, and there are a number of reasons for why that is. The first is, obviously, that Echo is a good person. I remember Jennifer Corbett referring to him as the moral compass of the Bad Batch in a Season 1 interview, and here he is telling Hunter that there are others in the galaxy who could use the Batch's help. Let's not forget that, in Season 1, Echo wanted the Bad Batch to join whatever rebellion against the Empire Rex has scrounged together at this point. He tells Hunter that this is because they're soldiers and asks what other path is there. For Echo, the Empire probably represents the antithesis of everything he thought the Republic stood for, and maybe he feels a kind of responsibility to keep fighting that fight. Additionally, and this is something I doubt the show will explore, but I think the clones still trapped under the Empire's control might start to wear on Echo a little bit. After all, something about the inhibitor chip activation is eerily similar to how Echo himself was weaponized by the Separatists on Skako Minor. There's a very similar eradication of autonomy and free will going on there, but I think that might be a little too dark for an animated Star Wars show to delve into. I think it's worth mentioning that I have seen some conversation floating around on the internet about whether or not Echo will leave the Bad Batch in Season 2 due to his differences with Hunter and his desire to fight back against the Empire. I have to say, I am so deeply conflicted about this theory. On one hand, it makes sense for Echo's character, but on the other, I just don't want him to leave. He's my favorite character, and he didn't have a lot of screen time last season. I would hate for him to leave the team just when he's starting to get a chance to be a part of it. Additionally, his decision to leave the 501st and join the Bad Batch in the Clone Wars kind of felt like a big deal, and in a weird way, having him leave kind of feels like a step backwards. Anyway, moving on in the character breakdown, let's talk for a moment about Omega. Omega has changed pretty significantly since Season 1. It's clear that she spent the time skip learning more about the galaxy outside of her very limited experience on Kamino, and she's been doing some combat training as well. In short, she's killing it. She's more capable and confident now, which naturally means she's more outspoken. She doesn't really wilt under Hunter's disappointed dad gaze the way she might once have, and in Episode 4, she dives into a confrontation that has nothing to do with her, unprompted. Her growing independence has me very curious about where she'll fall in the conversation about fighting the Empire or hiding from the Empire, the fight-or-flight debate, if you will. On one hand, she has shown a similar moral righteousness as Echo in the past, and in Episode 4, she proves that she has retained this outlook when she refuses to abandon Sid to her, let's be honest, self-imposed fate. At the same time, Omega cares deeply about keeping her family safe, and as we saw in the Season 2 premiere, she feels a sense of responsibility for their lives. Maybe she'll agree with Hunter and want to put as much distance between the Batch and the Empire as possible. I really wish we had learned more about Omega's backstory in Season 1. She tells the Batch that she remembers their creation on Kamino because she was there for it. She had been, in her words, alone in the lab until they were created, and that was why she was so determined to find them all again. This is kind of a big deal, and it really alters the way I see Omega and the Batch. She is simultaneously looking up to and learning from them, but it has to be weird to look at these grown men, soldiers turned mercenaries, and remember them as infants. I wonder if that could be a source of protectiveness or responsibility that she feels for the Batch. Either way, I do wish we had learned more about how that impacted her perspective of them. Finally, it's time to talk about Crosshair. I knew that Episode 3, The Solitary Clone, was going to mess with my emotions, and newsflash, I was right. Crosshair really is living his worst life as an Imperial soldier. He's completely isolated, and the Empire clearly couldn't care less whether he lives or dies. His attitude toward the regs has rightfully won him no friends on that front, and at this point, Rampart is probably wondering how best to dispose of him, knowing that he likely lied about his experience on Kamino to protect the lives of his former squad. There are exactly 0 good things in his life right now. I mean, look at his room. It is so sad and sparse and dark. When I first saw it, I thought he was in a prison cell. Viewed together, the first 3 episodes of this season really drove home a point about loneliness and belonging for me. Sure, we see some divisions forming within the Bad Batch as they try to decide what their next step is going to be, but it's never isolating. I can't imagine it getting to a point where their differences of opinion totally dissolve their relationships with each other. Even if, as I fear will be the case, Echo leaves the team, I think it will be painful precisely because this squad is a family and they care about each other. I mean, the batch spends most of the first 2 episodes getting separated and then struggling to find each other again, to literally bring the team back together. They work as a cohesive unit, watching each other's backs and prioritizing each other's safety over the success of the mission. The biggest inter-character conflict, which I'm going to talk about more in a moment, is between Echo and Omega, and it's prompted by a misunderstanding, and is soundly resolved by the end of episode 2. Crosshair, meanwhile, is totally alone. I mean, he's reunited with Commander Cody for a mission, and he seems, dare I say it, happy to see him, but we're told that Cody has left the Empire by the end of that same episode, and Crosshair is once again the solitary clone. Spoiler alert, that conversation between Cody and Crosshair, you know the one, is one of the 3 important conversations I'm going to be breaking down. I think Crosshair's isolation serves 2 purposes. The first is to show how he's being worn down as a character and as a soldier of the Empire. Not only is this kind of solitude detrimental to his mental and emotional health, but isolation tends to make people more impressionable. The Empire is using him, just like Hunter said they would back in Season 1, and the fact that Crosshair has no close friends or allies makes it even easier for them to do so. Crosshair's isolation also serves to show the audience that this isn't exactly what he wanted. Remember that Crosshair's original plan was to capture the rest of his squad and convince them to join the Empire with him. It was only after it became clear that they no longer trusted him that Crosshair put his foot down and joined the Empire alone. There's a moment in The Solitary Clone, after their shuttle is shot down, where Cody tells Crosshair that half of their squad is too injured to continue, and Crosshair responds, "I've beaten clankers with far less." Remember, the original Bad Batch was a squad of 4 clones with a 100% success rate during the Clone Wars. This line reminds viewers that Crosshair might be a solitary clone now, but he hasn't always been, nor did he ever want to be. Yeah, like I said, that episode messed me up. Now that we've recapped each character's starting point for this season, let's talk about some of those important conversations and what they tell us about the themes emerging in Season 2, and where those themes might take the main cast. The first conversation, obviously, is the one between Hunter and Echo in Spoils of War. I talked about this briefly in my last video as well, but I wanted to look a little more closely at what Echo is saying here. I've seen some people interpret his words very harshly, particularly his comment about the Batch's lives being like this because of Omega, and I really don't see why. After all, Echo is right. He is also not blaming Omega for anything. First, he tells Hunter that,
"With what we're up against, we have to be prepared to fight."
This comment comes before any mention of Omega or of others struggling against Imperial control. I found this line interesting because it seems to imply that, not only does Echo not want to hide away from the Empire, he doesn't believe it can be done. He says the squad needs to be prepared to fight with what they're up against, not with what they could be up against or what might happen. The Empire is an inherent presence in any plan for the future. For Echo, fighting the Empire might not just be the right thing to do, it's the only thing to do. When Hunter says that this isn't the kind of life Omega deserves, Echo responds with the apparently controversial line, "Our lives are like this because of Omega." What does Echo mean by this? It's not really because of Omega that the squad is living hand to mouth. It's because of Hunter. This is the arrangement he's made for them with Sid, and it's one he's been very reluctant to change. It's true that the Batch deserted the Empire at Omega's suggestion, but if they hadn't, it's not like they would have been welcome for very long. Remember, when they returned to Kamino after their failed mission on Onderon in Season 1, Tarkin was waiting to apprehend them. And sure, by taking Omega off Kamino, they invited all kinds of bounty hunter trouble, but that trouble has ceased now that the wider galaxy and anyone who would think to hire a bounty hunter to look for her thinks Omega is dead. So really, all Echo could be talking about here, which he confirms in his later conversation with Omega, is Omega telling the Batch that the Empire is different from the Republic, and Kamino is no longer safe for them. In that way, he isn't assigning any blame to Omega. He's pointing out that she's more aware of, and involved in, the realities of their lives as rogue clones than Hunter wants to believe. Sure, maybe it isn't the life she deserves, but it's also one she's already played a significant role in. Again, I'm really curious about where Omega is going to stand in this debate about fleeing from or fighting against the Empire. She deserves to live a life away from the fighting and the darkness of Imperial control, but she also has a history of putting herself right in the middle of it to help others. The second conversation I wanted to talk about, again, is Echo and Omega's conversation at the end of Ruins of War. This scene, more so than even the scene between Hunter and Echo, gives us a glimpse at the inner worlds of the characters involved. It's more emotionally driven than a lot of scenes in this show, and I really appreciated the understanding we gained of Echo and Omega's motivations, however brief. We also see a little of that sense of responsibility that Omega feels that I was talking about earlier. She tells Echo, "I know you all gave up everything because of me." Again, this is technically true. It was Omega who encouraged the Bad Batch to desert from the Imperial Army. But they weren't particularly welcome there, so what they gave up for Omega isn't much at the end of the day. To be fair, they didn't know they were going to be arrested at gunpoint when they returned to Camino for her. For all the Batch knew at that point, there might have been a place for them within the Empire, so maybe it's the thought that counts. Echo does correct Omega's misconception about what exactly the Batch gave up when he points out that they might be fighting for the Empire if not for Omega. They could have left the conversation there, with Echo reassuring Omega that she isn't to blame for the difficult situation the team has found themselves in, but they don't. There's this really sweet moment where Echo says, "We made the right choice, Omega. I'd do it all again." I feel like in this instance, he's referring to everything the squad has been through together, not just deserting the Empire, but running missions to keep a roof over their heads, facing bounty hunters, and teaching and training Omega along the way. I think the dynamic between Echo and Omega has a lot of potential. Again, they both serve as moral compasses for the rest of the team in Season 1, and in these first 2 episodes of Season 2, I think Echo is a kind of practical counterweight to Omega's need to prove herself and improve the life of her family. Omega makes a couple of desperate, impulsive decisions in these episodes, and I feel like she can learn a lot from Echo's more grounded, rational presence. I can't help but wonder what all of this means for the characters going forward. If Echo does leave the Bad Batch this season, could that inspire Omega to want to fight the Empire as well? Or conversely, could it scare her into wanting to get what's left of her family farther away? Omega is just a kid, and to lose first Crosshair and then Echo, albeit for very different reasons, would be difficult for her. There was a scene in the leaked Star Wars Celebration trailer that's been haunting me. Tech tells Omega, "We have to adapt. That is what soldiers do." And Omega replies, "But we're more than that. We're a family." I don't know where this scene will fall in Season 2, but I wonder if it could take place at a point where the disagreement between Hunter and Echo is threatening to further divide the team. I have to admit I am somewhat disheartened by the idea. Personally, I was hoping Season 2 would be about bringing the Batch back together, not tearing them further apart. Finally, let's talk about the conversation between Cody and Crosshair in Episode 3, The Solitary Clone. I loved this episode, and I thought this scene in particular was really significant, not only because we got to see how Cody feels about the Empire, but because we got a tiny glimpse of what's going on inside Crosshair's head. If there's one thing these conversations have been good for, it's getting characters to open up a little bit and actually tell each other, and the audience, what they're thinking. Crosshair, by virtue of being separated from the rest of the Batch, and until this episode, from anyone he knows well enough to actually talk to, has remained kind of enigmatic in the sense that he doesn't really tell anyone anything. In my first video, I broke down a few of the comments he makes to Hunter on Camino to try and get a clearer idea of what motivates Crosshair as a character and what his goals actually are. Finally, with this super short scene with Commander Cody, we get to see if my original theory, that Crosshair is motivated not by a loyalty to the Empire or its ideals, but by his own cold but keen survival instinct, still holds water. And in my opinion, it totally does. In an episode centered around him, the most telling thing Crosshair says or does is when Cody asks him if he thinks the Empire is making the galaxy better. Crosshair's response?
We're soldiers. We do what needs to be done.
There are two important things to notice here. The first is that Crosshair isn't answering Cody's question. He never does. And the second is that Crosshair doesn't defend the Empire or champion it as some kind of glorious new era for the galaxy. Instead, the only thing Crosshair says is to remind Cody of their place within the Empire, and the place of all clones, at least until they're phased out. Crosshair says that they do what needs to be done, but it leaves me wondering, to what end? To serve the Empire, or to survive within it? Then comes my favorite line of the entire episode. There were two kinds of soldiers during the Clone Wars: clones and battle droids, and Cody differentiates between the droid soldier and the human soldier when he says,
We make our own decisions, our own choices. And we have to live with them too.
I love a parallel. Remember in the Season 1 finale when Crosshair told Hunter that he made the wrong choice? The early episodes of Season 2 have been all about the choices Crosshair and Hunter made in the finale, and the consequences of those choices. My favorite part of this Cody quote is that last sentence, and we have to live with them too. I feel like that's the line that moves this moral dilemma from a Season 1 theme to a Season 2 theme. In Season 1, we saw Crosshair and the Bad Batch make different choices. In Season 2, we see them live with their choices. For the Batch, this means living hand to mouth, with their future uncertain and the Empire looming ever larger on the horizon. There's an inherent anxiety in their day-to-day lives, but as Hunter maintains, they are free, and they can rest secure in the knowledge that they aren't a part of the Empire's destruction. For Crosshair, living with his decision means being isolated and largely uncared for, diving headfirst into dangerous missions for an Empire that doesn't care if he lives or dies. Crosshair is neither safe nor free, but at least, as he maintains to Cody, he knows his purpose. I kind of hope that Crosshair's arc this season could be about realizing he is more than just a soldier, that he can find a purpose outside of the oppressive regime of the Empire, and, what's more, that he can escape and survive outside of Imperial control. To me, so much of Crosshair's character seems to actually be about fear. Fear of instability, fear of what happens to him once he stops serving the purpose he was created for by being a soldier. But like Omega says, the Batch are more than soldiers. If Crosshair is going to have some kind of redemption arc this season, I think it needs to start by having that realization. This video got a lot longer and more rambly than I had intended, so I'm going to leave it here for now. By the time I'm done editing it, I'm pretty sure we'll be almost halfway through the season. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and I'd love to know if anyone has any thoughts about this opening quarter of the season or where certain character arcs could be headed. Thank you again for watching. Till next time.